Reminds me a little of the last time I followed tracks in the snow. The steam rose as I blew into my hands, looking back at Grandpa as we made our way through the snowy forest. It was February, and the weather had been temperamental since Thanksgiving. We had experienced some thick snow since the 1st of December, and the usual decorations had looked pretty festive this year as they huddled amidst it. We had picked up as many of them as possible, but I knew that come spring we would find more of them buried where the snow had been. It figured this would be when Clarence, the cat owned by Grandpa's closest neighbor, would have chosen to get loose. Clarence was a large Mancoon, fluffier than most dogs, and she had been on the phone to Grandpa when I looked up to see the temperamental feline loping through the snow in front of our house. Grandpa had gone out to try to sweet-talk the ball of fur, looking ridiculous in his pajama pants and rain boots, as I stood on the porch and tried to get him to bundle up. He had been sick throughout Christmas, a nasty flu having put him to bed, and I'd been afraid I might wake up one morning to find that he had wheezed out his last. Then, the day before New Year's, I'd gotten up to find him cooking breakfast and feeling more like his old self. Now he was out in the snow looking for a cat, though he was more likely looking for a good case of pneumonia. To his credit, he had put on his cold weather clothes before heading out into the woods. He looked like a small bear in his snow pants and thick furry coat, his fluffy hat with the ear covers pulling the whole illusion together. Among other things on the long list of Grandpa's talents, he was a great tracker and had taken to the woods to find the cat. It didn't exactly take a master hunter to follow the cat's trail today, and it looked more like he had bounded from snowbank to snowbank. "Oh?" I said, feeling that maybe a Grandpa story would help move things along. "Of course. We were following something a little bigger than a cat that time." I shivered as Grandpa pushed a branch out of the way, a snowbank falling on top of my head. The cold powder fell off, thankfully, before it could melt and soak through my thick coat. "Hunting wolves?" I asked, joking but a little curious to know what Grandpa could have been hunting in the army. "Bigger than that," he said, looking between a pair of prints and following the smaller of the two. "Bear, maybe?" "Nope," he said, looking back to grin wickedly. "It was nothing short of the most dangerous prey of all. Man." John and I were on guard, keeping each other company through the cold night, when I first saw the lights off over a snowy hill. I could see a truck trudging angrily over the hills of snow, its lights heading for the nearby forest. The local woods weren't a great one, little more than 50 or 60 acres of dense and hardy mountain trees. The trees in Georgia were no lightweights, but these Alaskan trees were definitely built for the weather. You might ask what anyone was doing out in the middle of the night that close to the woods, but it was February, a little before Valentine's Day, and it had been dark nearly all day. In reality, they were driving up there about 6 p.m., right about the time our watch had started, and soon I could see a fire winking on the horizon. "Surely they aren't camping out there," I said to John. "Why not?" he asked. "If they've spotted a caribou herd and can take a few of them, all the better for the tribe." He took out his binoculars to see if he could catch a glimpse of anyone in particular, but despite the clearness of the night, it was no good. The best John could determine, there were 5 figures around a fire, and they seemed to be getting ready to head into the woods. He was a little more interested than I thought was strictly healthy, and finally John scoffed as he put down the binoculars and shook his head. "They can't be going into the woods. No one with any sense would go into the woods after dark." I snorted and commented that it was always dark this time of year, but John didn't laugh. "There are things here that know the difference between dark and night. If they're out there this late, they're either very foolish or they have grit." "Let's hope it's the grit then," I said. my breath puffing out as we kept our eternal vigil over the frozen tundra that stretched brightly around us. By this time, I had been in Alaska a year, the first of my 3-year stretch over there, and the cold never got any easier to handle. I don't remember being warm the whole time I was in Alaska. Not the sort of warm that I was used to. I was accustomed to sitting by a riverbank as spring bloomed, catching the sluggish fish that lays through the snowmelt. Alaska was beautiful, without a doubt, but I never quite acclimated to the weather. A few days later, John woke me up around midday, his own eyes a little less bleary this time. "I need your help, if you're willing." It was all he had to say. I was up and dressed in a matter of minutes, accepting a mug of cowboy coffee from John. He was dressed warmly, his thick service coat pulled up to the ears, which were covered by a furry hat I'd seen him wear often on post. He had a rifle slung over his shoulder, and his boots had fresh snow clinging to them. "What do you need?" I asked, pulling on my own coat and grabbing my sugging cap. Apparently, one of those foolish kids around the fire was my godson, Liam. He and some of his friends were looking for something that had taken some livestock off the farm, and they've been gone for 2 days. Charlotte is beside herself, and no one from the village wants to go into the woods to look for him or his friends. She called me earlier to ask if I'd help her, and I know how good you are in a pinch. I was already on board, but I was a little curious as we set off for the major's office. "Why won't anyone come help you find your godson?" John and I had been friends long enough that his silence told me more than his words. I could hear him grinding his teeth, a clear sign that he was overthinking something, and as the longhouse that served as the major's office got closer, he still hadn't made a decision. What was so important that he couldn't tell me, I wondered. There might be something dangerous out there, something that might require more than a rifle round. He looked at me like I might refuse to go now, but I laughed as I kept heading for the office. It wouldn't be the first boogin I've met on its own turf. "Let's go, John. We're wasting lack of daylight." An hour later, and we were both heading towards the woods, the old Jeep tires slipping a little on the fresh snow. The major hadn't wanted to let us both go. He didn't see any reason to let 2 soldiers slog through the woods looking for some town kids, and John's face had gotten pretty red when he'd said it. He looked like he meant to go no matter what the major said, but I stepped in and reminded him that we were only loosely tolerated in the settlement. They took our money and they let us live in their shadow, but they saw us as outsiders, and that was never going to change if we didn't show them that we could belong. Say the 2 of us go off in the woods and never come back. You can just say the 2 of us were deserters and that you told us not to leave. But if we find these kids, we're a couple of soldiers doing right by the town. Either way, you stand to lose very little and gain quite a lot. Major Charlotte was a Idaho native, about as big as his desk. I would have put him against any Rooski who wandered in, and maybe even some of the grizzly bears out there. He wasn't the brightest bulb on the base, but he could see a positive spin when it was shoved in his face. "You boys got till tomorrow, quadruple 0. If you ain't back to base 'fore then, I report you as deserters. If you ain't back 'fore then, I suggest you find a comfy spot to hunker with the Injuns." He allowed us to take our rifles and even told us we could borrow a Jeep to get out there. "Done drive my Jeep through the woods. On guard, boys," he warned us, and we promised that we wouldn't drive the Jeep off-road. We pulled up next to another Jeep that we had seen a few nights before when we were on post. It was 1400, but it was as dark as early evening. We flipped our torches on, and after some tromping, we found the remains of their campfire. They had left behind a few bottles, a little liquid courage, it seemed, and some wrappers from sandwiches or food of some kind. John was looking around the campsite, trying to find something to tell him what direction they had gone, but I knew it would be futile. It had snowed for 2 days, and the powder was nearly deep enough to cover the campfire. I waged that we'd find them somewhere in the woods if they were still alive. Is there a house out there? A cave, maybe? Somewhere they could have gotten out of the cold? John looked back at the foreboding canopy and shuddered. I have no idea. We don't go into these woods, or never did when I was young. Why? I asked, thinking it odd that anyone could quash the urge to take to the woods in search of game or just adventure. John looked at the midnight gathering of frosty trees and sighed stoically. It appears we have some time. Would you like to hear a story of these woods? I told him I would, and we crunched along as we headed into the tree line. My grandmother told me that long, long ago, when we were outsiders here, we came to settle and were hunted by something that we could not run from, something we could not escape. It came at night, hunting us as we shivered in our tents. Those who stood against it died. Those who hid were found, and no one was sure what to do. It wasn't just our tribe either. When we came together, other tribes reported losing people to this thing. Some believed it was death itself, come for us since we had dared to enter its domain. But others believed it might be something different. Our elders had faced things like this before, these creatures of the other world, and came out the victors, and they believed that they could do it again. As John told his tale, I began to see the woods around us as something different. I felt comfortable as the trees shaded us from the expressive sky, the womb of the woods, a place I had always loved in my boyhood. It was just another forest, my mind told me, and I knew how to move in a forest. I said I had never felt the warmth I had known in Appalachia, but as I moved naively through these woods, I felt a strange sort of warmth spread through me, the warmth of homecoming. And so, all the elders came together to discuss the issue. For days they deliberated, people still being drug off in the night. They discussed how it could be done, but they knew that they would have to know what they were dealing with first. They would need to trap the beast, and where better than a place it would feel safe enough to get cocky. They drew it into the woods with something they knew it couldn't resist, and when the trap was set and the sacrifice was released, they began to close the snare. As I moved through the woods, however, and John began to lay out his story, the forest changed. No longer was it a comfortable jaunt through the woods, but a crouching beast waiting to spring. Was this how the people in John's story had felt? Walking meat, just waiting for the butcher to come for them. The deeper we went, the more the beauty seemed like rouge smeared across the face of a monster. The farther in we went, the more that quiet weight hung around me. The barely contained hush seemed to be holding its breath, so I would drop my guard. As we clumped through the woods, my mind presented me with a picture of the beast that would be stalking us. A huge wolf, some massive black hound as big as a bear, stalking the woods as it followed us. It would be waiting behind a tree, peeking from behind a snowbank, and when it caught sight of me, it would grin with a mouthful of nasty teeth that would part to reveal its deep throat full of bellowing growls. It would blot out the moon as it leapt at us, burying us beneath its bulk and killing us before we could even scream. I was looking around, trying to catch the beast before it got us, when I tripped over something in the snow. As I looked to see what had spilled me, I found the first of our lost boys. His eyes were big and staring, frost forming on the orbs as he looked off into the woods. My foot had crunched through what I thought was ice, but turned out to be a gout of red that had turned solid. Something had ripped his throat out, leaving his meat frozen in the cold. His face was locked into the most exquisite look of terror, and I was tempted to run back to the jeep before I could encounter what had scared him so much. "Look," John whispered, pointing away from the body and towards the drag marks through the snow. It made a perfect little trail of frozen blood for us to follow, complete with several large and foreboding footprints. "Come on," John said. "That seems like a pretty good clue to me." As we walked on through the frozen wonderland, I suddenly couldn't stand the stifling quiet. "So, what was it?" "Could be a bear, maybe a wolf. Can't think of anything else that would—" "No, I mean the thing they trapped in your story." "Oh," John said, keeping his voice low as he let his rifle lead the way. "They called it the Quileute, and it was a spirit of death. They had believed it was many creatures, but what appeared was a single creature. It was hairless, an oddity in a place like this, and it appeared to be like a shaved wolf. Its grotesque body looked alien to them, its red eyes glaring from within the boundaries they had set for it. The only place it had hair was on its feet, and that seemed to work in its favor. It could move without leaving a trace, making it a dangerous foe in the wild. With the creature trapped, though, it seemed that they had bottled death, but they had done too well. As we moved, following the bloody trail, I began to believe I could almost hear the snow breaking as something followed us. Suddenly, death couldn't take them. The hunters feared no enemy. The explorers feared not the mountain's cold or height. They explored the unimaginable, fought the incredible, and learned the things that had eluded them. The longer it went on, however, the less there was to seek. People became stagnant, and many of them wished for an end. They had lived and wanted to move on to what came next. They wanted to see those who had gone before them, or to be reunited with their loved ones, and they knew of only one way to do it. "Can't imagine too much life being a problem," I whispered, but immediately regretted it. I supposed after seeing the bone collector, I could imagine too much life being a little bit problematic. It was always a stretch for me too when I was a kid, but as I get older, I can kind of imagine why it might get old. At any rate, they made a deal with the creature. They would send those to him who were ready to go, and any who were foolish enough to hunt the woods by night would be his prey. He would stalk the woods, but leave the places of man alone, and he agreed to such terms if he could walk the land again. We saw something jutting up from the snow, and as we followed the blood smears, we found a cave. To call it a cave might be a little generous, but it was an overhang and looked fairly dry inside. Without knowing what was in there, however, it might as well have been the open mouth of a dragon. As we hunkered down to peek inside, a snarling wolf head suddenly leered from the mouth of the cave. He was huge, almost as large as the bears we'd seen, and its fur was patchy and scraggy. Its pink skin was covered in sores, its nose split down the middle like Someone had taken a knife to it, and its teeth were double rows of sharp yellow fangs. It was a freak, a mutant of some sort, and both of us had 2 pounds of pressure on a 5-pound trigger when someone yelled for us to stop. "Don't shoot! Don't shoot!" From behind the creature came a half-grown man in filthy snow gear. "Liam," John said, pulling the man to him as he shivered in his arms. He was filthy and freezing, but he was still alive, and apparently the only survivor of the group. One of his legs was chewed up badly, his left arm a mass of infected-looking bites, and as he hobbled out of the woods, he told us what had happened. Ma was missing sheep, and Dad, well, you know Dad's been trapped by the same bottle he crawled into after the sawmill laid him off. Ma told me to just let it go. She always says it's the death hound, or whatever they call it, but I knew it was something flesh and blood. Spirits don't need to drag your sheep off into the woods, so we went to kill it. It got Ao first, drug him off into the dark, and tore him up. When we went to help him, it got Tom, too. It tore his throat out and just jumped on Mock, too. All the while, we just kept putting shots into it, and it shrugged it off like snowflakes. I ran as it jumped on Frank, and when I fell into that cave and bashed my head, everything went dark for a while. When I woke up, it was chewing on Frank, ignoring me as I pulled up my gun. It turned to look when I started shooting, though. I shot it 5 times before it finally stopped moving, and then I blacked out again. When I came awake, I was cut up and bit up and freezing. I pulled that thing on top of me and just kind of existed until you got here. He ended up living, but not without some scars. His arm became infected and had to come off, and he never walked again without a limp. Ultimately, John told me that he crawled into the same bottle as his father, and if I had demons like that kid, I probably would too. He'd seen some terrible things, but it was ultimately less supernatural than John had believed. We were back at the base for 1900 hours, and we were the toast of the town when we brought Liam home. The town did not accept us in one evening, but when I finally packed my bags and headed back to Georgia, I was welcome in any home within Weller Brock. I had ceased to be an outsider, one of the few who ever accomplished it. We were treading familiar territory again, and I could see the house coming into view. It was nearly dusk, and my fingers felt frozen as I stuffed them into my pockets. Grandpa didn't seem to notice, but I was sure his nose had taken on a slightly blue tint after trekking all day. "Looks like our quarry's led us all the way back to the start," I commented, a little sourly. "Guess we won't be catching him after all." "Don't be so sure," Grandpa said, and I was suddenly aware of another set of prints heading for the house. I smiled as I saw Glimmer sitting on the porch steps in her usual garb, as if it wasn't cold enough to make her breath puff out. The cat in question was sitting on her lap, purring happily as she stroked its fur. It looked up mistrustfully as we approached, but she made a soothing noise, and it melted against her once again.
"There you are, Hunter. And Fisher, too. It's bad manners to leave a lady sitting in the snow. I could have caught a chill."
She rose with the cat in her arms, pecking me on the cheek as she moved onto the porch. "He a friend of yours?" I teased, stroking the cat as he nestled against her.
"Nope. But I knew his grandsire. I met him in the woods while Fisher was away playing soldiers when I was a mere slip of a girl."
"Sounds like Grandpa isn't the only one with a story today," I joked, as Glimmer cocked an eyebrow at me.
"Perhaps, but only if you fix me some of that delicious milk water like last time and invite me in out of the cold. I'll be happy to tell you how I found a poor lost beastie in my woods one night, and how I first became aware of this most remarkable creature you call cats."
I smiled as the three of us came inside, Grandpa moving to the phone as I went to get the fire going. Hot chocolate and a roaring fire sounded like the perfect way to end one story and start another. The fire crackled merrily as Glimmer lay stretched out before it, the dancing flames making her skin twinkle, which was how she had gotten her name from Grandpa, and the dazzles sent diamonds across the ceiling. I had stopped in the doorway to the living room to watch her as she sparkled. She grinned at me impishly as she held her hands out for the warm beverage. It occurred to me how young she seemed. She was like a girl in her early 20s, in both appearance and mannerism. I wondered not for the first time if she would be that way when I was Grandpa's age. She patted the fireplace as she sat up, inviting me to sit with her, and I brought the hot cocoa to her as I leaned back against the rough stonework. Grandpa was sitting in his favorite chair, watching the two of us with a knowing smile. I appreciated him for that, more than he would ever know. It would have been easy for him to be hurt, but he always seemed to take the closeness of Glimmer and I as just one of life's little blessings. The widow had been very happy to have her cat back, and she thanked us for finding him quickly. "He's a silly old thing, but he's all I've got, and I'm quite fond of him. I'm glad he didn't wander off in the snow and get himself frozen to death." She had excused herself pretty quickly, telling Grandpa it looked like he was entertaining. She gave him a wink, and I'm not sure I understood it, and then she drove carefully down the driveway, Grandpa waving at her from the porch. The three of us settled in and got ready for Glimmer to begin her story, the fire the only light in the room. Glimmer took a sip of hot cocoa and made an appreciative noise as the warmth fell over her.
"That's good. We don't have anything quite that good in the woods."
"Are you telling me your civilization has existed since before settlers came from England, but you haven't figured out hot cocoa yet?" I asked with a little laugh. Glimmer gave me a withering look, but spoiled it by winking at me.
"We have sweets, of course, just nothing quite this frivolous exists in our world. We have more immediate concerns, like survival."
"And cats, apparently."
"Yes, and cats."
"Wait a minute," Grandpa said. "When I made you the wooden cat, you didn't seem so surprised."
"Well, I had seen wild cats before. They run everywhere in the forest. But this cat was different. He was so strange that I didn't immediately realize he was akin to the felines I knew."
She closed her eyes, and as the smoke wafted into her face, I could tell that she was time-traveling back to her girlhood days. Grandpa got that same look when he thought about the past, and I supposed it was universal. Glimmer was content to let the steam caress her for a few moments, beginning her story without much warning.
This was the time after Fisher's leaving. He had come to see me before he left, and he told me that he was going to fight in a war, that I have never fought in one. He said he would be gone for a long time, but that he hoped he would see me again. I didn't really understand, but I was upset at the thought of losing him. We had become close, and I didn't want to say goodbye. He told me this was something he had to do, but I didn't want to hear it. I told him to just go, that I didn't care if he came back or not, and turned away from him, so he wouldn't see the tears I was trying to hold back. When he said nothing, I turned back to find that I wasn't the only one failing to hold in my sorrow. I was used to seeing Fisher sad, but he had seemed different after his encounter with the bone collector. He told me this was a thing he had to do, and that getting away from the mountains for a while would be good for him. He wanted to see the world and grow into someone who could protect others. I refused to listen to his excuses though. I was young and spirited, and if he was going to leave, I told him to just go ahead and go. So we parted ways. I never knew if his sadness was as deep as mine, but it was several days before I was fit for much beyond moody turns. Life went on, though despite his advance, and many weeks later, I found myself in the woods again. Now, you may find it odd that I have never seen a cat before, but my people usually stay in the deep woods. I am considered an oddity because I will go so close to human places. In those days, I would not even go that far. Fisher had always come to visit me near the borders of my world and his, and without him to visit, I hadn't been anywhere near the humans in ages. On this particular day, I was supposed to be gathering herbs for medicine, so my mother could cure some of our people who had become ill. I had collected quite a few herbs, but when I found that I was close to the border again, I got a bit reminiscent of the times I had spent with Fisher. So I decided to go and have a look at some of the other people that live in the area. I didn't know any of them, but Fisher had talked about some of them. His parents, his grandmother that had passed on, some of his neighbors, and of the friends he often went out with, who I knew had been killed by the strange lights. I wasn't afraid of being seen by any of them. I could move as gracefully through the woods as any deer, and I had hidden from the humans before. So I took my sack and bow and decided to see what I could see. I was hopeful at the start, but it was not the grand adventure I thought it would. I saw human signs, old fires, and the waste they sometimes leave behind, but I encountered no people. I followed a trail to Fisher's old house, but I couldn't bring myself to get close. I missed him terribly, and the thought of seeing something that would remind me of him made me sad. I had turned around, preparing to head home again, when the strangest little creature stood in my path. His fur was the color of a campfire, with dark browns and dots of gray. His ears had a distinctly chewed look, and his paws were large and very furry. He held a magnificent tail behind him, and he had come up on me without a sound. I was startled at first, drawing my bow and challenging him, but he mewed good-naturedly and cocked his head as if to ask what I was doing. But when it became apparent that he meant me no harm, I put my weapon away and bent down to touch him. He was very soft, not bristly, like some of the other cats in the woods. He was a little muddy, but it was clear that someone was taking great care of him, farther than any cat I had ever seen, and he showed me none of the hesitancy around me that many of the forest creatures did. I sat and let him butt his head against my hand. My other hand glided along his silky fur, and when he came to sit in my lap, I giggled as he rumbled against my stomach. When I heard the sound of people returning to Fisher's old house, I realized I had been sitting there for a while. I had become enchanted with this little beastie, and as he walked back into the woods, I followed him eagerly. We spent the night in the forest, hunting mice and playing with the leaves and sticks that caught his attention. As the night went on, and the more time we spent together, the better I felt about Fisher leaving. We were cuddling in the boughs of a tree, when the first fingers of sunlight began to peek over the horizon. I realized I had been out all night with him, and when I picked him up and headed for home, I had every intention of taking him with me. As we walked back through the woods, I was confident that no one in my enclave would be seeing anything like this before. Some of them had cats, but nothing as grand as this one. One of my cousins had a beautiful spotted cat, and my older sister had a white one with red eyes, but their hair was short and coarse and nowhere near as luxurious as this fellow. I smiled to myself as I thought of the jealousy on their faces when they saw him. One's mother has touched his silky fur. There would be no way she couldn't turn it away. He would sleep next to my head at night, and I would drift off listening to the deep rumble of his purr. I was so involved with my daydream that I almost missed when he wiggled out of my arms. He had been riding along calmly until that point, purring against my side as the two of us walked. He looked back the way we could come and made that strange meow sound again. I was perplexed. Did he have a mate he needed to get back to? He started to walk away, but I picked him up again and tried to continue walking home. He wiggled out of my hands again though, and glanced back at me with remorse as he shook his little head. "What's wrong?" I asked. "Don't you want to come home with me?" In response, he started to walk off again. I took a step towards him, but I stopped myself before I could grab him up again. I turned around instead and headed for home, a little angry as I crunched through the underbrush. If he didn't want to come back with me, then so be it. I wouldn't force him. And the farther I got, the madder I became. Who cared if he didn't want to come back with me? I didn't need him. I had been fine before him, and I would be fine again. Let him wander off into the woods if that's what he wanted to do. Let him run afoul of a big mean coyote, or a hungry owl, or one of the bigger wildcats, or a snake, or... I wiped my eyes as they started to leak. The anger leaked out with them, and soon I was making my way back the way I had come. In my mind, I could really see him at the mercy of one of the coyote packs in the area or carried away by a hawk. He was a big fella, but wouldn't stand a chance against a pack of dogs. I wouldn't find him in time, I thought, or I would find him too late, or I would find nothing but a smear of blood and some of that gorgeous fur stuck in the pool. I swept at my eyes as the tears kept coming, already sure he was lost. The sky was pinkening through dawn still hours away, and when I heard him meow, I turned to find him cocking his head at me again. I laughed, scooping him into my arms and hugging him, and he wiggled and meowed in confusion. When I put him down again, he started walking the way we had come, and this time I followed him. I could see the light beginning to intrude on the dark world, but I didn't mind. Some members of my race cannot stand the light, but I have learned to love it. It stings my eyes and makes my skin burn a little, but I try to spend some time each day in the sun, knowing that my friends are part of that light world. That thin line on the horizon would have been enough to send both my parents scuttling back to the depths of the enclave, but I followed my new friend, evenly as he made his way. I expected I would find a little burrow of beasties like him, perhaps even some little ones with a mate who would be worried. But as we got closer to the edges of humanity, I realized where he was heading. When we came to the edge of his home, the lights already on the big house. He looked back at me, much the same way I had looked at him on the border of my world. "What? Don't you want to come with me?" That look said, but I shook my head at him. "No, this is where we must part ways, little friend." He came back, butting up against my leg and giving me another rub of his silky fur, and then he trotted off for home, bounding up in the back porch steps as he sat patiently at the door. I had turned to leave, the dawn very close now, when a high and excited voice found its way to my ear. "Clarence, you came back!" I peeked through the trees and saw a little girl pulling him into her arms. She couldn't have been more than 8 or 9, and as she rubbed her face against the gats, I realized this had been where he was returning to. She was his family. She was the one had been trying to get back to, and I felt a little guilty for trying to keep him. He had home already, and my ownership of him had been an act of death. "I told Mommy you wouldn't come back. I'm sorry I put you outside yesterday while I was trying to nap. I won't do it again. Come on, let's get you some breakfast. Then we can brush you and get you." But their plans were cut off by the closing door. And as the day began, I slipped back into the woods and made my day as home as well.
The fire crackled as she finished, and I saw a tear roll down her cheek as she remembered that day.
I think in a way that was how I said goodbye to you as well, Fisher.
To me? Grandpa smiled.
You were never mine to keep either, I felt hurt when you left, that I didn't admit it. You were gone, and I thought I could simply exist without you. Watching that cat go, realizing that it might get hurt and feeling hurt that it wouldn't stay, made me remember how you had left as well. I needed to come to terms with that, which helped a lot.
We all sat silently for a while, Glimmer putting her head on my shoulder as the fire crackled merrily behind us. When Grandpa chuckled suddenly, I looked up and saw Glimmer cock a sardonic eye at him. I had to get a cat out of the widow's house once. She didn't know it was a cat, of course. She thought it was a haint that had taken up residence in her attic. So there I am, prepared to do battle with a dark spirit, and I step into the attic and find myself face to face with a highly upset bobcat. Glimmer's hand slipped into mine as the two of us listened and laughed as Grandpa unfurled his tale of a spirited wild animal and a very surprised Grandpa. We sat by the fire as the snow came down, and the fire warmed our bones. I could feel Glimmer's comfortable weight as she leaned against me, and as Grandpa unveiled his latest story, I smiled, enjoying these small blessings as they came. The road rolled by like a gray snake as we made our way to Buford. Grandpa sat placidly in the passenger seat, taking it all in as the trees whipped past, and the concrete beneath our tires became the only soundtrack. We only left the mountains around Kashmir for a few reasons, and today's doctor's appointment was one of them. Granddad had a checkup with a specialist to make sure that the cold he'd had earlier this year hadn't damaged his lungs, and I was hoping for a good prognosis. Grandpa seemed fine, but I'd noticed a continuous brittle cough sometimes, especially while he slept. He didn't let it slow him down, but at his age, it was definitely something to be watched. I remember when a man's cough was his own business, and you didn't have to leave town for a little thing like that. Grandpa was a little grumpy about the whole thing. He saw no reason to go 3 towns and 2 hours up the road just so some doctor can use the same equipment that he has in his office. This fellow was a specialist too, he kept reminding me, and specialists always came at a premium. They would charge him an arm and a leg for something his doctor should have been able to do, and leave him a pauper at the end of his life. I reminded him often that he had Medicaid and didn't pay out of pocket for any of this, but that hardly seemed to help his mood. Hell, I kept the same cough for most of 1944, and it never slowed me down. Oh yeah, I said, remembering Grandpa's promise. You said you'd tell me about the end of the war. Grandpa never looked away from the window, but I could see him smile in his reflection. It's not as exciting as some of my other stories. You sure you want to hear it? Looks like we got some time to kill, I said with a shrug. Well then, I guess it all started around June in 1946. It was warming up a bit, a real Alaskan summer, and the war had been over for a few months. As the asphalt sped by beneath us, I settled in for a story as the trees that crowded the highway began to resemble the pines and spruces of Grandpa's northern home in the summer of his young adulthood. The war may have been over, but there was still a lot of cleanup to do. My platoon had gone overseas before the end of the war, but a few of us had stayed behind to keep watch. We were supposed to be watching for incursions by Japanese or Russians, but both fronts had been pretty quiet at the end of the war. Our brass was just starting to foster the paranoia that would take us into the Cold War, but Alaska was experiencing one of the warmest summers in a while. The snow had melted and many of the locals were taken to the waters to fish and hunt. We were seeing more small crafts than military fleet vessels these days. John and I had been selected to stay with the small unit they had stationed here, and we were about 30 in all at the base. Our days were spent keeping watch and keeping the place ship-shape, and there were some of the most comfortable times I'd ever experienced in the military. It had been about 4 years since I'd left home, and my tour was coming to an end. I could re-enlist, but with the war over, many of us were being discharged and sent home. The need for a large standing military, especially in a place like Alaska, was minimal, and John figured we wouldn't be in the barracks for much longer. Turned out he was spot on with that prediction. It was Wednesday when the trucks came in, and the major called our unit to the flagpole for reassignment. He called us last, and it seemed we were in for a surprise. "Smith and Register, you're being discharged. The United States would like to thank you for your service and wish you luck in your future pursuits." He handed each of us a manila envelope and nodded before leaving us to contemplate our turn of events. And just like that, it seemed my time in the army was over. John and I cleaned out our footlockers, and as we waited for his sister to come pick us up, John asked me what I would do now. I thought about it for a few minutes, but couldn't answer him right away, as it turned out. After some thought, I told him I guessed I'd go back to Georgia. I'd return to the forests and lakes that I loved and become a farmer or something, I suppose. I knew enough herb craft and handyman stuff to get by, but I admitted I had no real prospects. "Why not stay here for a little while?" he asked, almost hopefully. "Here?" I asked, not sure what he was driving at. "Yes, you've been a friend to me and the family, and we'd be happy to extend you our hospitality." "Well, my plane ticket's only good till the end of the week, but I guess I really don't have any pressing reason to go home." Truth be told, what John was suggesting was interesting, more interesting than farming, and I was curious to see what his intentions were now that the war was over. John's family were good people, and I'd gotten to know them quite well in the time I'd spent here. I knew they'd put me up, they'd probably help me find work, and I could do much worse than helping his sister in the library or one of his cousins on their many pursuits. Turned out that working for one of his cousins was just what John had in mind. John's family had a farm on the reservation, and it reminded me a lot of the house I grew up in. It was a long building with a lot of little rooms worked into it, and John lived there with his mother and father and their 3 remaining children. The other 3 were off on their own, but they came to visit pretty regularly. Sundays were usually busy as siblings and cousins and grandkids came to eat with the family, and I was welcome at their table just like any other relation. John's father had held me in high regard after I saved his grandson, and his daughter and I had become fast friends after the incident with the Rune. So I called my parents and told them I'd be spending some time in Alaska, and they said that sounded fine, but to be sure to keep in touch. John and I spent about a week on vacation before one day he took me to see one of his cousins. You know I drove truck after the war, but I bet you never guess how it started. John's cousin owned a small construction company before the war. The company had a reputation for working fast, efficiently, and not cutting corners when it counted. As such, he'd gotten a lot of military contracts when they started renovating a lot of the old military bases in Alaska so they could make them livable for soldiers. He'd come out of the war rather well off and was ready for a new challenge. He had used his trucks to help with the transport of goods sometimes, and he'd seen the merit in the transportation business and export line. He was starting a trucking company, something that was a little trickier in Alaska than it was in Georgia. His cousin Wayne was a beefy guy without much neck, and he looked at me without much confidence. "You ever drive truck before?" "Transport trucks in the military, sometimes regular trucks back home to help someone move or help pick something up." These are big trucks. Some of our routes take us over treacherous terrain. Can you handle yourself?" "I believe I can." He nodded, not really looking impressed, but clearly willing to give me a shot. He took me around and showed me the truck he had, introduced me to a guy named Doc who looked like a Yukon prospector more than a mechanic, and told me to show up Wednesday morning for my first delivery. "We'll start you off local so we can see how you work out and break you in slowly." These trucks weren't the huge 18-wheeled giants that have become so common these days. These trucks were more like troop transports I had driven sometimes for the military, and I could already feel the gears sticking and hear the brakes squealing any time I touched them. The loads we carried wouldn't be massive, likely only a few 100 pounds at a time, but a job was a job, and I was happy to be employed. John's father was glad to hear I was employed too, and said he'd rent me a room once I started making a steady wage. It's not fancy, and it's certainly not quiet, but it's a space to keep your things and a bed to sleep in. Room and board gets your meals as well, and we'll be happy to have a man like you under our roof." I thanked him, shaking his hand, and went to settle into my new place in the world. I would spend the next 6 years in Alaska, and sometimes I regret ever leaving. Alaska was where I learned to trade, where I met the best friend I ever had, and where I met your grandma. In a lot of ways, my life would have been very different if it weren't for Alaska. We might not even be having this conversation if they'd sent me to the front lines instead of sticking me in a frozen backwater. I'm pretty thankful now, but there were days I definitely questioned what I was doing there. Driving truck proved pretty easy, and I spent my days mostly hauling Wayne's equipment from one job site to the other. Wayne had about 20 guys in his outfit, and most mornings started by taking them to the job site, unloading their gear, and then taking some more to a second job site and repeating the process. Sometimes I helped them on the site. Sometimes I worked a few hours in the morning and was free to wander till they needed picking up again. Either way, there was money in my pocket, and I couldn't complain. John spent his days on the farm, helping his parents and siblings bring in the harvest or tending to the livestock, and we spent our evenings on the front porch drinking beer and talking about old times more often than not. Sometimes his siblings would join us. Sometimes we'd sit with each other for company. But I believe that John and I started the tradition that the two of us keep to this day. John had stories about his youth, and I had stories about Grandma and Glimmer and the oddities that I'd encountered in North Georgia. In John I found a kindred spirit, and his childhood seemed to be as fraught as mine. "It's nice to have someone to talk to about these kinds of things," he said one night after finishing a story about saving his cousin from one of the otter people who was supposed to live near the coast. "Even some of my own people don't believe in these things, and the ones that do don't often like to talk about it. Talking invites these creatures to come back, calls them to the teller, but I say that by telling, we spread knowledge. People should know that things like this are out there and that they can be dangerous if they aren't careful." I agreed, never having looked at storytelling in such a way before. I'd been working with Wayne for about 3 months when he came to me with something more substantial than his usual shuttle service idea. "One of my drivers fell and broke his leg this morning. He can't take the delivery to Taylor that he usually runs for me. I need you to take the milk truck up there and get the old bottles to repackage at the Silbury Dairy. This is one of my biggest clients, and if we can't make the delivery, they'll be left with about 100 gallons of spoiled milk. I know it's a big ask, but do you think you can do it?" I assured him that I could, and when I hopped behind the wheel of the milk truck, it felt like stepping back into that Jeep I'd driven to Nome a couple of years ago. The clock was running, time was a factor, and though it wasn't as dire as medicine for the bedridden, it was still pretty important. The bottles clinked against each other as I took off, and I heard 'em jingle all the way to Taylor. The roads back then were little more than dirt tracks, but the thick snows hadn't come yet, and the sun showed me the way as I rumbled over the ruts and holes. I passed through towns that I'd seen boarded against the blizzard last time I'd been here, and when I turned onto the last stretch of my journey, it was well before noon. The milk truck had been well kept, and the gears hardly whined as I shifted through them. It was hard not to keep an eye out for red lanterns or little hairy men on the hunt for game. Alaska was a place where you could plausibly catch sight of anything, a land that seemed steeped in magic, and I doubted then that it would ever be tamed as the West had. Alaska, like Appalachia, is not a place to surrender easily to new management. Nothing of note had happened until I came across the dog. He was a big old mutt. I had kind of thought he might be a wolf for a minute, but when he looked up at me, I could tell he was in a bad way. I pulled over to have a look, and it appeared that someone had run over his foot. He didn't have a collar, and I didn't see anyone nearby, so I put him in the back of the truck and figured I'd find him a spot in Taylor once I got there. His arrival proved to be lucky. I was about an hour out of Taylor when I found a tree across the road. We were coming through a valley, the hills high on either side, and I began to have thoughts about bandits or troublemakers. I took my knife and went to go check it out, looking around for signs of ambush as I went. It wasn't a very big tree, half-grown thing at best, and as I shifted it, I heard my new friend start growling. I dropped the tree and drew my knife, calling it a challenge to what I figured was a couple of would-be thieves. That's when I heard the noise. It was like squirrels with the volume turned up to 1,000, and the dog started to bark louder. I heard the sound retreating back up the hills, and I got there in time to watch the scrub grass shaking and find my new friend panting happily, looking very pleased with himself. I shrugged and got the tree out of the way and was back on the road in no time. The milk was there early, as it happened. Earlier by far, said the man who received it. Guy who usually brings it says he has to stop and clear the road a few times on the way here. Looks like you got the whole shipment, too. Other fellas usually missing a couple of bottles. I snorted, petting the shaggy mutt and realizing that an ambush had indeed been intended. I loaded up the empty bottles and made my way into town to see if I could get my new friend some help. The local vet patched him up and said he looked like a fine dog, and if I had a mind to keep him, that I'd probably get many good years out of him. I decided that was just what I meant to do, and loaded up so I could get myself back to the depot. We didn't encounter any trouble on the way home, and I never found another obstacle of that nature on the road again. Not when we were doing the milk run, that was. I dropped off the empty bottles at the dairy on the way back, and the woman at the receiving bay was glad to have them. She had been worried when she heard that Rod broke his leg, but she said it was a surprise to see me rolling in before dark. When I asked why, she told me a similar story to the one I'd heard earlier. Rod has some trouble on the way almost every time. We thought he was just making it up as an excuse for losing milk, but I guess he was telling the truth. Hopefully they use you more often. I might be able to eat dinner before 8 o'clock since I can start washing so early. Wayne was waiting for me on the front porch of the depot when I got back, and he handed me a bottle of something as I walked up. I just got a call from Ephra at the dairy. She said she was impressed by your speed and would be glad to see you drive the route again. I took a sip from the bottle and discovered it was a dark brown ale, probably homemade. I may have underestimated you, and for that I'm sorry. If you can maintain that kind of work ethic, I think we can start getting you some better jobs and some better routes. We clinked our bottles together, and it was the start of a fruitful period for me. I drove the milk run twice a week. I ran mail to the distribution centers sometimes. I drove to Nome and Bethel and even Anchorage a few times to take one thing or another. Wayne hadn't sugar-coated it. The roads were often dangerous, but I was careful and rarely missed the deadline. I did have one stipulation if I was to drive for him, and that was that the dog be allowed to live at the depot and accompany me when I made runs. Wayne said he'd been looking for a good dog, and Scrap became a familiar face in my cab and around the shop. When I finally left Alaska, Wayne said he would write me a recommendation for any trucking outfit I wanted, and he was sorry to lose such a good driver. I had many adventures on the open tracks, and they all started with that first milk run from Willowbrook to Taylor. We had entered the outskirts of Beaufort as Grandpa wrapped up his story, and I looked at him appreciatively as we rumbled along. "Sounds like you were one of the first ice road truckers," I joked, and Grandpa scoffed. "Pure silliness. Most of those guys play it up for the network. I definitely had some harrowing times and some tricky deliveries, but if every day had been like that, I'd have likely never made it all the 6 years. I did run up on a bear once, a big brown fella but we were pulling into the parking lot, and Grandpa shook his head. "Looks like we'll have to save that one for another time." I couldn't help but feel a little cheated. Grandpa's stories sometimes seemed as constant as the old man was, and I prayed they never ended. Grandpa and I were sitting in the living room when we heard the noise. Grandpa had just finished a breathing treatment, which may or may not have been why we didn't notice it sooner. He'd been prescribed 2 a day until the remains of his cough were gone, and he hated them. The little machine was too noisy, Grandpa said. The medicine tasted bad, Grandpa said. It was all a lot of fuss over nothing, but I saw the difference in his cough. Ever since the doctor had put him on the treatments, I had heard him cough maybe once or twice, but never with the volume he used to. He was practically back to his old self, and that was good. With summer already upon us, Grandpa was making plans that would take us out of the house and into the nearby woods quite often. This also made it a great incentive to take his medicine. If he wanted to go out adventuring, he needed to get his treatments finished. Grandpa had just put the little mask back on the machine when we heard an almighty rumble from just outside the window. I looked at Grandpa, wondering what it could be, but after hearing it a second time, Grandpa laughed and picked up his crossword. I had put my book down, wondering if we should be concerned about it, but Grandpa just waved it away. "It's nothing, just a bear sleeping under the back porch." "A bear?" I said, my fears not dampened in the least. "They do that from time to time. It's probably a young bear who's away from his den for the first time and just looking for a spot to sleep for the night." It was getting dark out there, the sun dipping below the trees as Grandpa and I whiled away our evening. I'd been thinking I might go out and call Glimmer so we could meet up for a walk, but the presence of a bear made me think better of it. The bears around here aren't usually keen on people, and I had little doubt that if I went messing around by the porch, I'd invoke his ire. Grandpa looked up, snorting at my look of trepidation. "It's not a big deal. Least, it's outside. Heck, I once drove about 70 miles with a real beast in the back of my truck." The one in the front yard?" I asked skeptically. "No, when I drove in Alaska." I was already on my way to the kitchen to get a couple of beers. We probably couldn't go drinking on the porch, but we could enjoy them and Grandpa's story right here in the living room. I'd opened them up and came back in, and we clinked bottles as I took a seat and settled in. "Well, if you insist, it all started with my first trip to Nome. John's younger brother woke me up one morning to tell me that Wayne was calling for me. I'd been driving truck for him for about 1.5 years now, and I was pretty happy with the job. I got to drive all over the place and see all kinds of things. The pay was good, and there was a little gas stop on the way to Taylor that served a pretty good lunch and had a cute waitress I had kind of fallen for. I was hoping that he was calling to send me in that direction, but it turned out he had bigger plans that day. "Jack, I need you to go to Nome and make a very special delivery." My ears perked up. I'd never been to Nome. I knew it was a pretty big city, a place a young man might get into trouble if he wasn't careful, and I was excited to see a new place. We were still using the old transport trucks, and I knew that if it was a long haul, I'd be driving one of the nicer ones. The nice hauler trucks were always the best maintained, and usually had a working heater, too. "I'm in. What's the job, Wayne?" "There's a fella in town that wants us to take a load of expensive furniture up there. It's really pretty stuff, handmade from local wood, and the guy in Nome is paying him top dollar for it. He's offering to pay us some of those top dollars if we get it there on the quick, like within 48 hours. I whistled. Nome wasn't a short drive, and to get there before the marker, I'd have to drive all night to do it. It was doable. I'd done it before, but that was going to be a hell of a drive. We talked a bit about pay, and after settling on a special rate for a special job, I got up and got ready to head out. I took my thermos, a radio I had from my army days, and dressed warm in case the heater didn't work. This was early spring, and there was still snow on the ground, but I wanted to be warm if something unforeseen popped up. Turned out, something unforeseen was waiting for me up the way. Wayne had Tallulah ready for me by the time I got there. Tallulah was our best rig. It was the closest thing to a semi-truck that we had, and the back was big enough to carry all the furniture and then some. Wayne asked if I wanted scrap, but I told him it would be a bad trip to take the dog on. Time was of the essence, and scrap was likely to slow me down. I checked the back, pulled up into the cab, and told Wayne I'd see him in a couple of days. "Once you drop off your load, feel free to stop for a rest. Don't be stupid and try to cruise all the way home. You're only human." I told him I'd be careful, and one thermos of coffee later, I was on the road to Nome. The road, like I said, wasn't really a road like you'd think back then. If it was on concrete, I was in a big city or a major town or a military installation. Most of the time, I was driving on dirt roads packed tight from many wheels. The going was only bad in a few places, and the truck was heavy enough that the ice never really slowed me down much. Braking was always a harrowing experience, but it was something I'd gotten used to. Even when you weren't trying to stop on snow, the ground was stony, the dirt was flaky, and you were just as likely to slide off an embankment in the summer as winter. The trip to Nome was pretty uneventful, though I did get lost once and had to find a workaround. Luckily, a sign popped up before I got too turned around. I made it to Nome in just over 42 hours, and it was one of the first real cities I'd seen in a while. It wasn't as grand as it would become, but given that I hadn't seen a big city since driving through Atlanta to get to Basic, I was certainly impressed. It took me another hour to find the fella's address, but I soon had the furniture unloaded, with some help from his sons, and I was on my way again. I should have stopped in Nome, but after looking at what the hotels wanted for the night, I decided to head back out and just sleep in the cab after I'd gotten down the road a piece. Turned out that piece was only about an hour out of town, and by then my eyes were trying to snap shut like cheap window shades. I pulled over to the side of the road, made sure everything was as secure as it could be, and stretched out across the seat to catch a little rest. I had slept for about 6 hours when suddenly something rattled the truck. I was pulled awake by a sudden jolt, and as the wheels settled, I wondered how much of that had been a dream and how much had been reality. I looked around the cab and realized I wasn't going to get any answers in there. Stepping out into the cold March air, I checked the truck for damage. The trailer was fine, the wheels intact, and everything appeared to be ship-shape. I checked the inside of the trailer and saw that the big blanket that had covered the furniture was still there, but whatever had jounced the truck had knocked the flaps loose that kept the back covered. I retied it and got back in the cab, now fully awake and ready to roll again. I had driven a while, heading for home, when something moved in the back of the trailer. It wasn't much, just a little shift, but it made me wonder if the blanket was the only thing back there. I thought about pulling over to check, but opted against it. I could feel the way the wind was hitting the side of the trailer and just knew that it would be colder than a witch's tit out there. I was hoping to make some miles before stopping again, and as we rolled along, it seemed like smooth sailing. I had a few more hours of easy driving to go, but eventually my luck ran out. I was navigating some tricky turns, the road narrow and a little icy, when I took one of them a little too hard. I heard something slide in the back, and when it connected with the side of the trailer, it loosed an angry roar that sounded huge. I was so surprised by the noise I nearly ran off the road. I wondered if I'd fallen asleep at the wheel when something slammed into the other side of the trailer. It hit the wall, bouncing like a pinball as I tried to keep the truck from tipping over. Whatever it was huge. It took everything I had to keep from sliding off the edge, and as it roared again, I thought I had a monster in the back of the truck. It was heavy enough to jounce the trailer, but not quite heavy enough to tip it over. I could hear the angry sound of metal as it grated long claws over the inside, and I expected to see holes at any minute. I was terrified to stop, thinking it might get into the cab if it knew I was in there. Finally, I just slowed down some so it could escape if it wanted to. I felt a cold draft a moment later, and wouldn't realize till I stopped afterwards why. The thing had torn a gash in the back cab about as wide as my hand, and the claw it had used to do it had missed me by inches. At the time, though, all I felt was a sudden rush of air, followed by a huge jounce that felt like something had hit the back of the truck again. I looked in the mirror and saw the length of canvas that covered the back of the trailer flapping in the middle of the road, and the body of an absolutely massive grizzly bear barely visible beneath it. The paws, however, were on full display, and they were the biggest I had ever seen. I could feel it watching me as I drove away, and I didn't dare stop until I had put many, many miles between us. I was fully awake then, and I would be for the next 12 hours. I made the trip back in record time, and when Wayne asked what had happened to the back of the trailer, I told him the story. To my surprise, he laughed. "You gotta watch where you stop around here, Jack. You'll get all kinds of stowaways if you park too close to the woods for too long. Don't worry, I won't take the repairs out of your pay this time." I was always careful when I parked for the night after that, but that furry fellow wasn't the only passenger I ever had. As I sat listening to Grandpa's story, the snores of the bear made a fitting backdrop. "Sounds like an unbearable situation," I said, and Grandpa rolled his eyes as he chuckled in spite of the corn. "I guess you could say it was a grisly experience. He was definitely the worst guest I had in my truck," Grandpa said, covering a yawn as he sat back in his chair. "That reminded me of something else. Hey, didn't you tell me once you picked up Santa Claus? I could have sworn you said you did, but you never told me if it was in Georgia or But that's when I heard a second snoring join the first, and I knew that story time was over. I threw one of the big blankets over Grandpa and went upstairs to get ready for bed. Grandpa snored happily in his easy chair as he dreamed of frozen roads, great bears, and times gone by. I was mowing the grass when it happened. It was approaching July, and Grandpa's property was small but in constant need of a cut. The rains had been numerous in the last few months, the lightning cutting the sky with long forks that shook the mountains most nights, and Grandpa's grass would be ankle-deep by next Friday if this kept up. I didn't really mind mowing the half-acre that held Grandpa's house, but the acre in the down below that he also owned was full of stones and roots that would make the endeavor treacherous. I was cutting around the back of the house when I suddenly heard the sound of a flute. I picked my head up, the setting sun making me squint as I looked at the woods. The flute was high, something about it sounding almost magical, and I felt my feet taking me towards the dark mouth of the forest. I was like those children in the story about the mice, and with each step I felt less in control of myself. I began to sway a little, the charms and the wards that had been slow to come to my mind, now falling hollowly away in the face of such a draw. I had just passed into the shadowy embrace of the forest canopy when someone tackled me around the waist and pushed me to the ground. I struggled against the person, my feet jouncing in tune with the flute, but as the music began to move away, I looked up to find that Glimmer sat atop me. Hell of a greeting, Glimmer, as usual. I expected to see her childish smile full of mischief, but her face was absolutely dour.
You are lucky I came to rescue, Hunter. What were you thinking? Following the fairy pipes into the woods? You could have been killed.
Good thing you were here to save me from the woodwind section, I said, a little flippantly, though I meant it in jest. What's all the ruckus? Came a voice from the house, and Grandpa came stumping onto the porch. He looked concerned, but it was tinged with good humor at the sight of us rolling in the grass clippings. Clearly, he thought he had come across something a little more intimate, but one look at Glimmer cleared that right up.
Hunter was about to follow the Faye music into the woods,
Glimmer stated matter-of-factly as she helped me get up. Jesus, boy, didn't I teach you better than that? What in the hell is Faye music? I asked, now completely confused as I wiped grass clippings off myself. Grandpa started to look cross, but then scratched his chin as he thought about it. Have I never told you about the Faye music? Fairy lights, yes. Faye music, no, I said. Glimmer turned her angry look upon Grandpa now.
Fisher, how could you not warn him? You know how devious they are.
Well, excuse me, Grandpa huffed, throwing his hands up. There's a lot of things in the woods that could kill any one of us, and not all of them are magical or unknown. A few minutes later, as the sun settled into the dying light of the day, and our drinks sat sweating in their cup holders, we sat on the porch as Grandpa told me about what had nearly ended my life. Faye music isn't actually of the Fae, Grandpa amended, but that's what Glimmer's always called it.
It is what Father always called them, and just because it's not connected to the fairy courts doesn't mean it isn't of Fae.
Are you ever going to elaborate on these fairy courts that you keep talking about? I asked, more curious about them than the weird forest music. Focus, Hoss. We ain't talking about fairies tonight. The Fae music is disembodied music that guides people into the woods so that whatever is causing it can take them away and do whatever it intends to do with them. Wait, so does it kill them or just take them?
No one knows. Those who are taken never return. Whether they are devoured by whatever plays the music or simply takes them to Fae for sport, no one ever returns.
I took a long sip as I thought that over, not sure what to say about it. It isn't even native to the Appalachian area. I first encountered it in Alaska, and other people have reported hearing it in the desert, while at sea, and one in the tundras of Siberia. Whatever it is, it's greedy, and it's hungry. Glimmer looked up from the condensation on the side of her bottle, loving to watch the moisture trail as it slid down.
Wait, You never told me that you heard the fairy pipes in this Alaska place.
Yup, one night while I was drinking with John, actually. He started to take a sip, but stopped as he noticed us eyeing him intently. What?
Nothing. This is just usually when you tell us another of your stories about times gone by.
Yeah, we just assumed you were setting us up for a grandpa story. Grandpa drained his beer in a single long pull before tossing the bottle over his shoulder, where it bounced off a tree and fell without breaking. I mean, if you insist, it all started much like this, with lukewarm beer and good friends telling tales on John's porch. John and I were sitting on the porch with two of his younger cousins. Both were in high school and were visiting for the summer, and the four of us were sharing tales. The oldest of the two, Moss, was telling us about how he'd been fishing in his kayak when something had bumped him and made him lose his paddle. After a few hours of aimless floating, he had been pushed back to shore by something and hadn't taken to the water again since. Could have been a whale or an orca, I suppose, but Da always figured it was the Kushtaka. They had probably taken my oar to begin with and then felt bad about it after the fact when they realized I'd drift off into the ocean. We sat in silence for a few minutes, sipping our beers and contemplating. That night, however, only one great mystery had my mind, and that was whether I could make it to the edge of the woods before my bladder burst. I had become gripped by a sudden and monstrous need to make water, and now that the story was told, it had reared its head like a breaching whale to remind me that it was here and must be served. I excused myself, leaving my bottle on the porch rail and high-stepping it to the woods as my drinking mates laughed behind me. I hit the edge of the trees, unzipped, and let fly as my groaning innards sighed happily. The night beyond the porch was lit by little besides the moon, and as I watched the trees sway in the light wind, I couldn't help but shudder a little. After the fairy lights, I didn't much like to be in the woods at night, and these woods were as far from my woods as they got. Everything from the stony soil to the strange trees made me feel like an explorer in a foreign land. I had just finished, my zipper still halfway up, when I heard the first halting refrains of the last thing I had expected. It was a piano, and it was playing something deep and haunting. I looked back towards the collection of houses, expecting to hear it coming from somebody's open window, but when I looked back, I realized it was coming from the woods. It was music played by a master, someone who had perfected their craft over years and decades and millennia. I took a curious step forward, wanting to see if it was a real piano or just someone with a radio, but that step became another as my curious feet brought me into the dark woods. The moon was muted here, the ground a mystery that my feet seemed to understand better than I did. I went a little deeper, the music calling me to explore, and before I knew it, the warm glow of civilization was nothing but a suggestion behind me. That was when I realized something more than piano music might be going on here. Whatever curiosity had taken me was beginning to ebb as the memories of my last moonlit stroll reasserted themselves. Had my chase with the fairy lights really been so different? My drunken friends and I had gone tripping through the woods as we chased our death, and only I had come back again. Whatever this was, I feared it meant to do the same thing, and though I pulled against it, I was powerless to stop my feet from pulling me ceaselessly forward. I tried to reach out for a nearby tree, but it appeared my arms were outside my control as well. I was a fly in the spider's web, a bug in the mouth of a fly trap, and I was walking straight into danger. The song played on, never ending, and although I had to be getting closer, the volume of the music never increased. It was like the insectile ree of the cricket, and it seemed always out of sight and out of reach. I went on, the piano and its player never coming into focus, and that might have been all that saved my life in the end. I don't know how long I walked, but it had to be about an hour. I had been barefoot, and though my feet knew the path, they didn't seem to care if the path was over sharp rocks or through summer thorns. I tried to cry out, but my mouth didn't work either. My legs and feet were soon battered and bleeding, and I suppose that if they noticed me gone, their dogs might have a good fresh trail to lead them to the scene of my demise. As if summoned by my thoughts, I began to hear voices. I wondered if it was part of the music for a moment, but when John's voice rose to call my name, I tried to call back to him. My vocal cords, however, were just as useless as they had been when I stubbed my toe or cut my leg. I could only manage a useless mewling sound and prayed that maybe my feet would lead them to me as I crunched along. John's voice sounded miles away, his cousin's farther than that, and as I continued to cry out, I tried to get control of my body again. Just my voice, that would be all I would need. Just a yelp or a yell, and they'd be able to find me. Just a shout or a noise, and they'd know where I was. I could hear them getting closer. At least John was, and the more I tried to yell, the less seemed to come out. I closed my eyes, trying to summon all my strength, but I was powerless to stop this. Was this really how I was going to die? I thought. I'd stood against the bone collector. I'd stood up to ghosts and survived. I'd been brave enough to sign up to take part in a war that took me farther from home than I'd ever been. I'd done all these things, and this was how I was going to shake out. It didn't seem fair. Why let me overcome so much just to die like this? Little did I know that dying wasn't what fate had in mind for me. "You lost, boy?" I opened my eyes just as something poked me straight in the forehead. A little old man was standing in front of me, his weathered face looking like a canvas of age. He was stooped, his gnarled hands wrapped around a wooden walking stick, and my eyes crossed as I tried to focus on the large, wrinkled finger that sat square in the middle of my forehead. I took a moment to notice that the music had ceased, to be replaced by the sounds of insects as the forest came back to life. What did you do?" I half whispered, stepping back with a harsh jerk as I pulled away from his finger. "Got 'em out of your head," the old man said. John called out again, and I found that I was able to answer him this time. I called out, letting them know that I was here. I expected to turn back and find the old man gone. That was usually how it worked, but I jumped a little when I turned back to find him, still standing there. He was looking at me strangely, his head cocked a little to the side, like a dog with a scent. "Not your first time stumbling across the unknown, I'd say?" the old man asked, and he grinned toothlessly when I nodded. "You must be the young man living with my nephew and his family." I started to ask what he meant, but John came out of the bush then and asked if I was okay. "We got scared when you never came back. Then Moss started heading into the woods, and I suspected it might be, but he noticed the strange man then, and his face split into a smile. "Great Uncle Nat, it's good to see you. Did you have a good trip?" "I did, nephew. I see you've made a new friend." He looked at me then, smiling wetly before saying, "Come to my trailer when you have a free moment. I would be very interested to know what sort of knowledge we might trade." He stumped past us, making his way easily through the woods as John and I watched. That was how I learned about the Faye music, what the natives call spirit noises, and met John's great uncle Nat. He was a man I would come to admire and learn much more from. The crickets in our own wood made a fantastic background as Grandpa's story came to an end. We were left sitting there, listening to the night unfurl around us, before it was broken by the sound of a smashing bottle. Grandpa had launched another beer bottle into the woods before settling back in his lawn chair. Nat would sort of become my mentor, as Grandma once had. I would learn a lot from Nat, and it was all things I would bring back to Appalachia when I eventually returned. I would hear the fairy music again when I returned, but I was ready then, and it never trapped me like that again. I leaned my head against Glimmer's, listening for the music I had heard earlier, and glad not to hear it. Appalachia is a magical place, but it can be unforgiving. I resigned myself to be more steadfast in my studies with Grandpa. I wanted to be ready the next time I heard the pipes. Hey there, everybody. It's Dr. Plague, just popping in at the end to say a very special thanks to our guest voice tonight, La Dama de Blanca. For my Spanish-speaking listeners, she narrates creepypastas in Spanish, so if you'd like to listen to her, I'll leave a link below to her channel. I'm sure some of you have found me through there. She's really fond of my stories, and she likes to narrate them. I was so honored to have her reprise her role as Glimmer, and it's always a pleasure to have her on the show. Thanks, La Dama. My grandpa stories just wouldn't be the same without you as the voice of Glimmer. Alright, let's roll those end credits.